If there's one thing that has characterized Ukraine in the post-Soviet era, it has been corruption. For years, news items like this have been frequent in the international media.
Welcome to Ukraine, the most corrupt nation in Europe.
Ukraine has always had a bad reputation in this regard. No wonder, as according to Transparency International, we're talking about the most corrupt country in Europe. A very corrupt country, which has traditionally been run by an elite group that did and undid as it pleased, and which, naturally, completely controlled political power. Among those responsible for all this mess are a small group of billionaires, whose fortunes do not have a particularly clean origin. Indeed, we're talking about the oligarchs. Just as in Russia, the oligarchs are the legacy of the economic and political decomposition that these republics suffered following the fall of the Soviet Union. We are talking about people who, in many cases, worked within the Soviet government itself, or at least were very close to it, and people who took advantage of that position to get their hands on as much wealth and as many resources and state-owned enterprises as possible when all these government properties were privatized. In Ukraine, during the first privatizations led by Prime Minister Leonid Kuchma in the 1990s, these oligarchs managed to buy shares in state-owned companies at ridiculous prices. How did they do it? I'm sure you have an idea. The privatizations were intended to create a market in which people could buy shares in companies that had previously been state-owned. To this end, the government distributed vouchers exchangeable for shares. However, the reality was different from the intended outcome. A large number of Ukrainians, as a result of the deep economic crisis following the fall of the USSR, sold their vouchers at a ridiculous price in order to make quick money. The sale of the vouchers was not legal, but the black market grew like wildfire. Shares they did not understand in companies they didn't trust, or money to feed their families. The decision was a foregone conclusion. The current oligarchs managed to amass a huge amount of vouchers for a couple of bucks, then converted them into shares, and took over the productive fabric of the country. As a result, the national economy was concentrated in a very few hands. And that's basically how it has been up until now. A small group of people have been controlling almost the entire economy, particularly industry and strategic sectors such as steel and energy. Sectors that in practice are held to ransom by corrupt millionaires who have taken great care to tie themselves to political power in order to avoid any competition. This VisualPolitik community helps explain to a large extent why in some countries like Ukraine or Russia, this process was a real disaster, unlike other places like the Baltic Republics or the Czech Republic, where things were done completely differently. But that's not all. Over time, these businessmen formed their own clans of oligarchs. The one in Donetsk, for example, is still active in the metallurgical sector. The one in Dnipropetrovsk controlled the oil and commercial activity in the south of the country, and the one in Kyiv concentrated a great deal of political power. Ukraine's oligarch system is basically a reflection of the one in Russia in the 1990s, although today they are no longer so similar. Now, with Putin, all the oligarchs are subordinate to the government and depend on it, but in Ukraine, that change has never happened. So the reality has been just the opposite. The government has been subordinated to the oligarchs themselves. These days, Ukraine, especially since the Euromaidan revolution of 2014, has been trying to turn this situation around, with more or less success. As the country has tried to move closer to the European Union, it has been creating new anti-corruption mechanisms and gradually cleaning up the old practices of its political class. Having become the poorest country in Europe made many young people say, enough is enough. Zelensky's own government has been the toughest on this issue, to the point that an old friend of the Ukrainian president was even arrested, something totally unimaginable just a few years ago.
Ukrainian oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky detained on suspicion of fraud and money laundering.
However, we come to the point in the story that you all know by now. The full-scale invasion by Russia. And the question is, what effect is the war with Russia having on the corruption and influence of the oligarchs? Could this be a golden opportunity to reset and wipe the slate clean? Could Russia inadvertently push for a radical change in the Ukrainian economy and society? What if that were already happening? Well, stay tuned because this video may change the way that we look at Ukraine.
The other victims of the war.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a huge catastrophe that is leaving behind a macabre trail of death and destruction, the likes of which Europe has not seen for a long time. Between 31,000 and 70,000 military personnel killed in action, depending on which source we choose. Some 12,000 civilians killed, more than 6 million refugees, and hundreds of thousands of families torn apart. It is the direct result of the invasion. But beyond this drama, and drama with capital letters, what if I told you that there are other victims along the way that are not so often talked about? We are indeed talking about the Ukrainian oligarchs. You see, the fact is that since the war began, all of the oligarchs, without exception, have lost a good chunk of their property. In many cases, their enterprises and their factories have been destroyed. Do you remember the brutal siege against the Azovstal factory in Mariupol? Well, without going any further, that factory belongs to, or at least belonged to, the oligarch you see on the screen, Rinat Akhmetov. The Azovstal mill alone accounted for 1/5 of all Ukrainian steel production. And of course, that was not all this man had. Neither in wealth nor, for that matter, in power. Akhmetov is considered the leader of the most powerful clan in all of Ukraine, the Donetsk clan. This industrial region focused on mining, and energy has revolved around his figure. To give you an idea, he amassed a fortune of almost $14 billion, making him the richest and most influential man in the country. However, with the Russian invasion, Akhmetov's fortune has plummeted to the point that today, according to some estimates, he may have lost about 2/3 of his entire estate. His fortune is still enormous, but it's no longer what it once was. Just think, the Russians not only destroyed Azovstal, but they also destroyed his energy company, D-Tech, which before the war supplied 30% of all electricity in the country. We're talking about losses of some $10 billion, which, as you can imagine, have made Akhmetov, once a colleague of the Russians with whom he did business, now unwilling to see Putin or any of his clique, even in the slightest. This man went from being the main financier of the pro-Russian Party of Regions to suing Russia in international courts.
Ukraine's richest man sues Russia at Europe's top human rights court.
But that's not the end of the story. Akhmetov also controlled one of the leading media outlets, Media Group Ukraine, a media outlet that did not hesitate to openly support former pro-Russian Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych. Yes, the very president who the Ukrainians themselves kicked out during the Euromaidan. Some say that Akhmetov, like many other oligarchs, is neither pro-Russian nor pro-Ukrainian, but basically pro-money. And the truth is that this has been the case up until now. Of course, things may be very different in the future. We'll talk about that in a moment. But back to the subject. Akhmetov is not the only one who has lost a lot of money with the war. VisualPolitik viewers, none of Ukraine's big oligarchs are spared from burning. In total, among the country's 20 largest fortunes, they have lost more than $20 billion since the invasion began. Petro Poroshenko, another oligarch who will ring a bell because he became president of Ukraine between 2014 and 2019, is another good example. In fact, some of his properties have been seized for supporting the pro-Russian rebels in Donbass through energy businesses.
Former Ukraine president returns to Kyiv to face treason charges. Prosecutor claims Petro Poroshenko was involved in financing of Russian-backed separatists in 2014 to 15.
I know, Ukrainian politics is enough to drive you to tears. To get your hopes up for a politician, there almost guarantees a bucket of cold water is about to hit you. That is precisely why, in the last elections, Zelensky, a comedian from outside the traditional circles of power, was elected. VisualPolitik community, Ukrainian politics is a mess, and if we bring the oligarchs into the equation, it's time to run away. And that's precisely why what happens with all these characters could be absolutely key for the future of this country. The feeling is that the oligarchs have already accepted that Ukraine's European path is irreversible, and that is why they are trying to salvage the furniture, whatever it takes to try to keep as many of the privileges they had before the Russian invasion as possible. In fact, that is surely what explains why most of them donated millions of dollars to the Ukrainian military, even as many of them have puffed up for years doing business with Putin's Russia. And in many cases, with the same Russian oligarchs who have later defended and financed the invasion of Ukraine. Well, a Along these lines, for example, the old friend Akhmetov donated more than $70 million to the Ukrainian armed forces. And let me tell you, he was not the only one. Viktor Pinchuk, another metallurgy oligarch, bought $25 million worth of bulletproof vests, medical equipment, and communication systems for the troops in the first 3 months of the war alone. At the same time, they had no choice but to accept the seizure of their assets in strategic companies for the war effort, such as the oil company Ukronafta or the aircraft engine company Motor Sich. Let me insist, they have done it without complaining. You know, you have to save the furniture any way you can. But why do we say save the furniture? Well, basically, because the oligarchs have one main objective: to recover as much of their wealth as they can and keep their assets without them being seized by the government. And in order for that to happen, the war has to end. Of course, the plan is not going to be so easy for them. Ukraine has been trying to change course economically for years, and surely once the war is over, this will intensify even more. Of course, Brussels' demands will do a lot of damage to widespread corruption, and here the oligarchs may have a serious problem. Think about it. Will they really be able to keep the wealth they have achieved through political favors and by hijacking entire economic sectors, preventing competition? This is a model that will no longer exist in a new, let's call it, European Ukraine. So the question is very clear. What does the future hold for them? Well, to find out, we first have to look at what Zelensky has been doing since he came to power. Listen up.
Zelensky, the implacable.
Do you remember the news item with which we opened this video? The arrest of the oligarch Igor Kolomoisky. Well, this news headline hides several clues. You see, Kolomoisky is not just any oligarch. He is the founder of Privatbank, the country's largest commercial bank, which is now nationalized. On top of that, he was one of the key entrepreneurs in the Ukrainian oil sector until the state took control of Ukronafta and Ukrotatnafta, and until Russia bombed his refinery in Kremenchuk. And not only that, does the Azov Battalion ring a bell? Well, following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the war unleashed in the Donbass, Kolomoisky was responsible for showering the Azov Battalion with millions to fight on rebel territory. Now, why are we telling you all this? Well, you see, as we've already told you, this guy was a good friend of Zelensky. What's more, he used his TV channel 1+1 to launch Zelensky to popularity. Do you want an example? Servant of the People, the series that made Zelensky most famous, in which he played the very president of Ukraine, was broadcast on that channel. A series, by the way, you can watch on Netflix. Perhaps Kolomoisky thought, if the actor wins, surely I'm safe. Well, if he thought so, he was badly mistaken. Kolomoisky is in the crosshairs of the United States. In fact, since 2021, he has been sanctioned for corruption and the laundering of $5 billion. Although the truth is that he lived more or less quietly until September 2023, when Ukraine arrested and prosecuted him for several crimes. And this is precisely the warning that the rest of the oligarchs should take into account. If the one closest to Zelensky has ended up like this, what will become of the rest? Well, we don't know how much time the Ukrainian president may have left in office, nor whether or not he will finally run for re-election. But if any of his own follow his path, which seems quite likely, the end of the oligarchs as we knew them could be very near.
Ukraine president vows anti-corruption drive, says people tired of waiting for better life.
The fight against the oligarchy is something that has to happen if the anti-corruption policies demanded by the European Union are to be implemented. And not only that, when the war is over, Ukraine is likely to receive tens of billions of dollars in aid, both to rebuild the country and to pay public salaries and pensions until the country can support itself again. That river of money will almost certainly not fall from the sky without conditions. And not surprisingly, relying on the cleanliness and good work of Ukrainian institutions is still rather imprudent today. So the Allies will surely take advantage of this need for funds to force Ukraine once and for all to push through the missing reforms in the political, judicial, and administrative system. And that, obviously, is not very good news for some oligarchs who, for decades, have built their wealth through corruption and political favors. They know that the fight against corruption will go straight for them. Something that, by the way, already started to happen even before the Russian invasion of 2022. In fact, in 2021, President Zelensky himself launched one of his most famous measures against corruption, the famous anti-oligarch law. We're talking about a rule that establishes a series of requirements for being considered an oligarch, and that afterwards, whoever was classified as such was subject to additional economic and financial restrictions and controls. For example, people considered as oligarchs cannot donate to political parties, nor can they participate in the privatization of new companies. The requirements to be part of this select list? Well, basically, being involved in the world of politics, having a significant influence in the media, exceeding $81 million in assets, and to be benefiting from monopolies. Those who meet at least 3 of these 4 criteria would be considered oligarchs in the eyes of the state. And although the law has not yet begun to be fully implemented, because it was decided to wait until the end of the war, the truth is that it's already having an effect. Oligarchs like Poroshenko and Akhmetov have shed their power in the media, and others like Vadim Novinsky have resigned from politics, also as not to be labeled as oligarchs.
Ex-President Petro Poroshenko says he has sold 2 television stations to current and former employees to comply with a controversial new law targeting Ukraine's wealthiest individuals.
With all this, Zelensky has been pursuing one goal: to put an end to corruption and to distance himself from previous presidents who basically only opted for measures that were more cosmetic than effective. Still, you have to give the devil his due. The Poroshenko government, for example, promoted the creation of the National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption and the Supreme Anti-Corruption Court, which began to prosecute some oligarchs. For example, Oleg Bakhmatyuk and Kostyatin Zivahod, both bank owners, have been in legal trouble for years for economic crimes. But now, with the war and especially in its aftermath, Zelensky has seen an opportunity to weaken oligarchs with less wealth than ever before. And do you know what that means? Exactly, that with less economic power, political influence is also much lower. On top of that, there is another factor, and that is that Zelensky is tremendously popular, almost a war hero for Ukrainians. And the oligarchs who might once have been against him now don't even dare cough at him, especially when they themselves are now more unpopular than ever. The war has had a completely undesired effect for Putin. It is germinating a strong national sentiment. In fact, faced with a particularly bleak future for them, they know that their best chance of survival is to jump on Zelensky's boat. True, the president will probably continue his crusade against their corruption, but think about it for a moment. If you were one of these oligarchs, which would you prefer? To conform to new rules while keeping your assets, or risk losing everything? I think the answer is obvious. Most likely in the future, when the anti-corruption reforms and institutional improvement demanded by Brussels are completed, some kind of agreement will be reached for the oligarchs to keep most of their assets. Perhaps a kind of amnesty in exchange for major investments. The formula remains to be seen. What seems clear is that the immense power of the oligarchs has come to an end, or in other words, their conversion into true entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs who will have to accept the rules of an open market and compete on a level playing field. Be that as it may, this will be good news for Ukraine. What's more, this process will inevitably be accompanied by a productive change, something that, by the way, has already been happening for about a decade. For example, agribusiness and digital enterprises have grown much faster than the traditional sectors inherited from the Soviet era, such as metallurgy, which are precisely those most controlled by the oligarchy. This, in turn, is also contributing to the gradual dilution of the traditional power of the oligarchs. Now at this point, the question is over to you. Do you think that the Ukrainian oligarchy as we know it today will eventually disappear? Will they accept and manage to become regular businessmen like those in any other Western country? Well, leave us your opinions below in the comments and we'll start a debate. And very importantly, if you like this video, please like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you very much for being there. All the best. See you next time.